Hello and welcome again. In the last video, I closed with some fairly strong words about not complying with the instruction to swear one's oath to the Constitution. This has provoked some discussion, which is a good thing, of course, and welcomed. One of the best points raised was touched upon in the interview with William Keat and I on the Richard Vobes show on Anzac Day, April 25th. There, it was pointed out that in 1215, most people were illiterate, so it may have been more likely that such an oath would have been verbally or orally sworn, as those alleging themselves to be constables swear their oaths on their graduation day. Also raised was the fact that Article 61 itself doesn't specify how that oath was to be worded, which allows some degree of latitude as to how that should be. Another salient point to come up was the fact, also mentioned in the interview, that no one person has the right to compel or order another person as to how to behave, only insofar as they may need to be reprimanded or ordered to provide recompense for a crime against another by a jury of their peers, according to the due processes of law. It is certainly incumbent on each individual to comply with natural or constitutional law, but Article 61 doesn't compel this legislatively. It is for each one to respond to this compulsion out of their innate obligation to stand for truth and against lies or falsehoods under natural law. As Will explained so eloquently at about the 58-minute mark, even without the existence of Article 61, it's our moral obligation to speak out and oppose all forms of evil, especially those which cause harm to other people. Article 61 gives us a lawful vehicle and cause to oppose the criminality we see from those falsely claiming to be the government. Moving on to the main theme of this talk, it's necessary to respond to the question first raised by Will in his initial interview with Richard and by a number of people in the comments to this interview, which is, what is the point of sending notices to criminals when they are simply going to adopt the view that as long as nearly everyone accepts their behaviour as legitimate, there's nothing to stop them continuing as before? The answer is that if only a few people do dissent, which is for reasons discussed in earlier videos preferred to the word rebel, which can have negative or belligerent connotations, then of course no long-term changes are going to eventuate. Those few who are willing and of sufficient understanding and strength of purpose to pursue the issue to the end will mostly find, as did David Robinson, that they will succeed in having unjust demands removed from them because of the courts' and judges' reluctance to have their crimes exposed in public. It is better for the criminals to let a few people escape their clutches than to have a growing number of cases where the evidence, which is irrefutable, becomes known to an ever-growing number. During that process, however, these dissenters will be subjected to threats, harassment, even unlawful treatment such as false arrests and illegal or unlawful confiscation of property. And it's fair to say that not a large percentage of people can handle such treatment easily. It's highly stressful, and added to that is, of course, the pressure from spouses or family members who may not understand the principles involved and simply want the process to end so that normal life may be resumed. The answer to that question is that the process has to start with someone, and if everyone leaves it to everyone else, we remain in the state described in the famous story of everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. When we ask why it is that so few people, after 22 years of Article 61 being in effect, are actively following the process outlined, in whatever form it may be laid out for them, be it by stalwarts and brave people like David Robinson and Elizabeth Beckett, or anyone else who understands the principles underlying this entire issue, we are left with a number of possibilities. But three of them are probably foremost, so let's look at them. The first is undoubtedly the fear of what the government is going to do to them if they speak out or show any resistance. Won't they end up taking my driving licence or impounding my car or sending around bailiffs to confiscate property or dragging me into court and giving me a big fine or even jail time if I don't do as I'm told? These are all questions and fears that whirl around in our minds when we contemplate the step of going against everything we've ever been told about the government and the law. The second, and possibly even more threatening, is the fear of what will happen to my marriage if my spouse doesn't see this the way I do and insists that I comply, because we have enough stress in our lives already. What if it comes down to an ultimatum? It's either your wacko political beliefs and your weirdo friends or me. And the third is the view that it's just too big a task to undertake, and learning the process and, even more importantly, the principles underlying natural or constitutional law is just not interesting enough or too time-consuming to even commence. Let's deal with the first two. After that, the third one might not seem so insurmountable. A number of times during this series of videos, I've mentioned the concept of complying under duress. It's a prominent point in some of the rebuttal or covering letters we send to amplify our position with the corporate impostors claiming to be Crown agents. The principles behind this step are, firstly, to minimise harm to ourselves from people behaving lawlessly. Just as we would if armed criminals burst into our home or place of work and threatened to do us serious harm if we didn't comply with their demands, which might be to hand over our money or other valuables, or even to engage in activities which we find repulsive, etc. In such circumstances, it's reasonable to adopt the view that it's best to survive to fight another day. No one should condemn us for breaking our oath and doing something we normally wouldn't to support criminal or treasonous activity if we are under threat of having our lives seriously disrupted or our homes filled with discord. It is no one else's business. They can't understand the circumstances or stresses of our situation, and the same applies in reverse, of course. Secondly, this step enables us to still place those abusing us on notice, all the while compiling our files of evidence for the eventual time when trial by jury is restored and the offenders are called to account for their crimes. We must remember that only the higher-ranking ones are aware of their criminality. Most of the lower echelons of public servants are blithely unaware that they are committing very serious offences, and it's our moral obligation to inform them. After that, we're no longer accountable or complicit in their activities, and they're on their own. With the police, it's slightly different. They do actually swear an oath to uphold the King's peace. And if they choose to then obey corporate overlords and deliberately infringe people's basic rights, we should warn them in no uncertain terms that their retribution will be more severe than that meted out to those who may be initially excused or given the benefit of the doubt of ignorance. There is no excuse for police ignorance. If they don't understand that, they are unfit for purpose anyway. However, we can still comply with their unlawful demands without fear of lawful retribution if we have first made clear our objections to their lawlessness. For this reason, it's important to follow Will's recommendation and the ones made throughout this series and place on notice those corporate entities which are most likely to infringe against us at some stage, namely the famous 3 Cs, courts, cops and councils. Remember them? It is far more preferable to do this before we run foul of some legislative puffery which seeks to daub us with the brush of criminality when we have not actually harmed anyone. Then, if we try to follow traffic and parking regulations, etc., a bit more assiduously, we may be able to avoid these annoying fines and not find ourselves in a backs-to-the-wall situation. Things like council rates and income tax, etc., will pursue us anyway, but we can then refer to the notices we've already sent, and at least we'll be on the front foot if we later decide to comply under duress. When we do so, our recently written 6th notice of duress of circumstances, can be sent, which outlines in strong terms that they are simply adding the crime of extortion to the other torts they have already committed, and for which they will eventually stand trial, possibly before some of those they have victimised, since there will be few who haven't been so offended against. We can suggest politely that they might like to find an honest job where they can operate within the law. The goal of suggesting this strategy is to encourage many more people to take up the cudgels in defence of truth and freedom. It minimises the potential of familial discord because we won't be placing ourselves and others in our families at risk of collateral damage because we want to stand on principle. There cannot be a more peaceful way to distress the Crown, and the cost is minimal. We send these notices by recorded post, and that only costs a few dollars each. We are devising ways of recording how many and to whom these notices have been sent. And when we have large enough numbers, then will come the time when we can present a united voice to these impostors that they've been advised of their crimes by significant numbers of people too many to all be arrested, for example, and that we're now going to stop complying en masse, and they had better sue for peace and clemency while they still may. For those who complain that it's all a bit too much trouble and things haven't got that bad for them as yet, I suggest they study a bit of history. One doesn't have to go back even a century to discover what can happen when the mass of people are indifferent to principle. We are where we are today because generation after generation has taken the view that it's not too bad yet, and if it gets any worse, well, our children or grandchildren can sort it out. That is not a morally viable attitude, and now we are perilously close to becoming permanently enslaved in the type of dystopian technocracy that I remember reading about as a boy when I first became aware of science fiction books and brilliant authors like George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, and Philip K. Dick. The universe runs on natural laws, and every entity must live according to those laws if it wants to survive and prosper. Human beings can only survive as free entities if we comply with natural laws, and one of them is that if we tolerate criminal behaviour in any form, which by definition involves some people trampling the rights of others, we are not behaving morally. We are attempting or assisting to bend the universe out of shape. But it will always snap back into shape, and the consequences of that are what is commonly termed karma. Human society will remain being ruled by tyrants, with most of humanity under some form of despotic rule, until enough of us learn these principles of morality, which when adhered to, provide us with freedom. Thank you for watching.